Okay, well, thank you all for being here. So, as Anya said, I'm Sindiso Mnisi Weeks. I teach here at SCISD, and as Dimity said, I spent the summer doing something which I think was exciting. Certainly, I found it to be enriching. I had a Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship, which had me based at the University of Cape Town for 6 weeks, working with the Land and Accountability Research Center, which actually used to be the Rural Women's Action Research Program, and I used to actually be fully employed with them before I came and joined SCISD. So as the title would say, the work that we do is action research around rural women's issues, and so I did a number of different things. I was doing some research projects, I was doing some seminars and teaching, I was doing some civil society capacity building workshops and public education and writing in different forums, for publication in academic press as well as in popular press. And so this comes out of a what I would say is probably the biggest thing that I did this fellowship, which was produce a submission to what is called, and the name is so long I can't even remember it, the High-Level Panel on the Assessment of Key Legislation and the Acceleration of Fundamental Change. And this is a panel that was put together by the Speakers Forum, and so this is the Speaker of Parliament, National Assembly, and the National Council of Provinces, as well as the speakers of all of the provincial legislatures. And basically they arrived at the conclusion that almost a quarter of a century into South Africa's independence or democracy, post-apartheid, there needed to be some sort of comprehensive evaluation of the state of laws and policies and how effective or ineffective they were and where changes needed to be made. And towards the end, they actually had 3 focus panels, focus areas. One was on land, one was on social cohesion, and one was on sort of economic development and transformation. And so this was at the end of their process because they actually produced and delivered their summary report last month. But they realized that they actually hadn't had enough stuff on gender. So they decided that they needed to hold a joint session of all 3 sub-panels to basically bring up the gender issues and, across the different areas. So this was this gender panel, and not working. Okay, so this is just me doing some of the stuff that I did, but this was the sort of panel. So the panelists are in the front, and then the presenters, as you can see, all of us women in the back. And you had speakers on farm workers' rights, on union rights, especially the rights of women, female union workers, mine workers, and like rural women in deep rural areas. And I was kind of the sort of expert presenter, and then other folks, as in like academic expert presenter, and then other folks were kind of coming from CBO backgrounds or the unions themselves and kind of presenting some of the on-the-ground stuff. But because, of course, a lot of my work is actually on the ground, I started by sharing stories. And so I thought I would share what I presented in the submission, because actually in the process of preparing it, it dawned on me that this was a really good summation of the work that I'd done over the last 10 years of my life. Because I've written a lot on women's rights in Indigenous communities. I've written a lot about women's ability to participate in decision-making processes, and the limitations of that as a consequence, the limitations on that as a consequence of legal interventions. And this actually gave me a really great opportunity to step back and say, what is the actual takeaway from all of the work that I've written in these different components? And I think at the end of the day that the title that you guys saw was that message, that gender matters or ultimately power matters, and laws and policies are actually really important because of how they shift the power balance on the ground and therefore affect the ways in which women are able to negotiate for their security in the contexts in which they find themselves. And so that's the message of this presentation. And like I said, I like to start with narratives. And so I'm going to start with a couple of stories, which are actually stories that are part of the research that I published in a book that's hopefully coming out at the end of this year. And they are stories coming out from conflict resolution processes within the indigenous communities that I was studying in the easternmost province of South Africa, known as KwaZulu-Natal, KZN. So these stories basically boil down to a simple narrative of the fact that actually women in rural South Africa in these communities often find themselves actually having to stay married in order to hold on to property because their circumstances in their marriages are so insecure, both materially and physically, that actually they have to stay in that sort of socially insecure circumstance in order to hold on to some degree of material security. So I start by telling the story of all the names have been changed, by the way, but I call this lady Manovalo, and she's an older adult woman, sort of in her middle ages, and she was the victim of severe and repeated domestic violence by her husband, who I call Tujimpi. Who wielded a gun and, in fact, tormented her whenever he was drunk, which unfortunately was very often. The matter came before the headman. So just so you have a sense of the structure, the headman is that kind of primary cog, if you will, of the dispute resolution system. And so the matter had come to the headman's council because Tujimpi had attempted to shoot a neighbor, accusing him of harboring his wife, who had actually fled to the neighbor's house because her husband was again threatening to shoot her. When we interviewed her, she told us that she told us why she hadn't left her husband, because obviously that was, one of the questions. And she said that she was aware that her husband was having an affair and that he was terrorizing her in order to get her out of the house. In her estimation, Manovalo's estimation, her husband would always threaten her with his firearm when he returned from being with his other woman. And she was sure that he wanted to get her out of the house so that the other woman would come and take her place. And it emerged that no matter the cost, and of course the cost was pretty high in the sense of her own well-being, and in fact, her daughter was very clearly sort of mentally disturbed by the situation, just psychologically disturbed by it. And so Manovalo, regardless of these aspects, was not prepared to leave the home because she said she had built it. And in tears, she said to us that she was prepared to die if she had to in order to hold on to her home. In the attempt to mediate the matter, the neighborhood council, because the headman had actually referred it to the neighborhood council, so you see just on the left-hand side of the forum structure, because he said it was better sort of resolved in the immediate surroundings. The neighborhood council was unable to effectively manage the dispute, and so Tujimpi frankly had admitted to the conflicts between his wife and him over his mistress. But then the council told him that he should actually have gathered the family council. So you see, if you drop down to the bottommost corner, that's the family council, because that should actually be the first port of call when there is a family dispute or intra-family dispute. And so they said he should have called the family council, and they asked why he didn't, and he couldn't provide a reason for failing to do this. And so the council members then suggested that Tujimpi should actually rather have moved her back to her birth family instead of trying to shoot at her. And they petitioned him to stop harassing her. And then they instructed her to be respectful and patient toward him and his affair. So this is Manovalo's case, right? In a different dispute, Mazmele, another woman of similar age, sort of middle age, who was nominated by the traditional council. So if you go up to Gwankosi at the chiefs, there's a council there, the chiefs council, primarily headmen. There's a council that actually has some women because of legislative requirements that it have some representation of women. So she was nominated to this particular council, which I refer to as this legislative administrative council. And she actually had been chased away from her marital home by her husband because she refused to conceal a firearm at his request. Of course, you're getting the sense now that Msinga is actually quite a violent place and has a very high propensity of gun violence due to the significant availability of firearms. It's actually been called the sort of gun frontier or the gun center of the South African trade, the gun trade. And so Mazimelo took the matter to the chief, Gwankosi, in the form of a proceeding that's actually not quite a case, but people refer to it as a plea or a petition or a cry. And there her husband said he could not be with a wife who was one of three, who quote unquote refused to listen to him. So the chief was unable to reconcile the parties through this process. And so Mazimele, but he did actually find in Mazimele's favor. And he said, it's inappropriate what the husband's doing. And so Mazimele moved back home from her brother's home because she'd moved temporarily to her brother's house, but moved back to her marital house. And she said that she moved back despite the risks because she didn't want to leave her children. Her husband, Gwajisa, and his older wife, Mamdala, then moved out of the home. The third wife already lived in town. And so Mazimele remained alone at the house, and she made improvements to the home, etc. But then Gwajisa brought a charge against her for damaging existing property. So she says that in order to make improvements to the house, she had actually removed the rubble of houses belonging to the older wife, Mamdala, because Mamdala had actually razed the buildings to the ground when they'd moved, sort of as an act of defiance, I suppose. But then Gwajisa was accusing Mazimele of doing this damage to quote-unquote his land without his approval, right? So Mazimele maintained that she would have moved to other land if her husband had given her some or helped her to obtain it by asking for land on her behalf, because women at the time were not allowed to have land independently of their husbands, or independently of some man. So Mazimele then reported that it was obvious that her husband wanted to kill her, but unfortunately the chief seemed unable to provide her with help beyond his order, so because of course he'd already found in favor of her in this matter. So he recommended to her that she report the matter to the police. That's the state police, right on the screen. And meanwhile, Gwajisa, who refused to return to the chief's forum, her husband, despite being summoned to further dialogue there, he then initiated civil proceedings against his wife through a lawyer, so the magistrate's court in the topmost forum. And she said she didn't have the means to defend herself against such a lawsuit. So what do these cases tell us? Other than life can be really hard and it can be really depressing. Well, I think these cases tell us a few things. One is that power is actually really essential and women have very little of it. And so I think rural people's existences in general are dependent on power. And this is because in order to negotiate their security, so they live in a very relational context where, their survival is so embedded in their relationships. They truly mutually depend upon each other for survival. And so that means that you're constantly having to negotiate your security with those people with whom you are in relationship. And so, women fall prey to a whole lot of vulnerabilities when they're not able to negotiate effectively. And you find that actually women, often report that they are evicted from their homes when their marriages fail, or when they're widows, they're evicted from their marital homes that they lived in with their spouses. Divorced and widowed women who return to their birth homes, their natal homes, when their marriages end, often find that they're made unwelcome and evicted by their brothers, right? Unmarried sisters often are evicted from their natal homes by their married brothers after the parents die, and sons, because the sons assert that they alone inherit the land, even when the father had actually chosen the daughter to be responsible for the family home. And so married women and single women and widowed women and separated women, divorced women are all kind of vulnerable to this notion that land belongs to the men and that women's access to land has to be mediated through their relationship with the men. And therefore they're in this sort of dependent relationship. So that's the first thing that it tells us. But one thing that's important to know is that that's not like that notion didn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so actually there's a lot of compelling evidence about how colonial authorities and apartheid authorities in South Africa subsequent to colonialism actually advanced this notion of customary law, and I use inverted commas to indicate that actually the customary law wasn't so customary. There's some fascinating reports from the 1800s where you have these British colonial commissions where the commissioners are saying, oh my goodness, after testimony that women were allowed to choose their own spouses, they're like, oh, these women are too liberated, they clearly will be out of control, we have to give men more power. And so it was a very clearly sort of deliberate initiative on the part of the colonial and apartheid authorities to give men more power. And in South Africa, what that looks like is legislation where women, and I quote here, it says, a native woman who is a partner in a customary union and who is living with her husband shall be deemed to be a minor and her husband shall be deemed to be her guardian. And in other legislation, it refers to women and children as inmates in the homestead of the man of the house. And so there's this really clear sense in which women, and the term we use is perpetual minority, where women went from being under the control of their fathers to being under the control of their husbands and couldn't own property in their own right. And so obviously customary law on the ground would adapt around these legal demands where, when a woman's husband dies and she goes to the commissioners who are, administrators of the colonial administration, and says, well, I'm entitled to this property. They say, no, you're not entitled to any property because you're a woman, right? And so customary law sort of adapted to that. And of course, customary law actually did have patriarchal components, but the evidence is pretty compelling that they were both patriarchal and matriarchal elements, and these tempered one another in a sort of delicate balance. And again, that speaks to power, right? A sort of power-based negotiation. And what this legislation did is that it shifted the power balance very distinctly in favor of men, emphasizing the patriarchal elements and rejecting the matriarchal elements within these cultures. And then what that results in a context in which women's securities is embedded, as I said earlier, in their relationship and is actually contingent upon these sort of reciprocal arrangements within their relationships, is that their rights are also dependent on that, right? Like their ability to make claims as to what they are entitled to for the purposes of their survival is itself embedded in that context. And what's interesting here is to note the literature about customary law and the nature of customary law. The term customary law in and of itself is very problematic by virtue of the fact that, when we think of law, we think of a very formalistic system. We think of a system whereby the norms are clearly articulated and they're applied in a sort of very precise and systematic manner, and a decision comes out on the other side, and that is authoritative. But actually, aside from all of the studies that show that that's not even true in the state system, right? There's even more compelling evidence to show that in indigenous communities, that just is not the notion of law that is in operation. And so when a system of norms is contingent upon people being able to negotiate. And so actually there's, Komarov and Roberts, who did this research in Botswana amongst the Tswana people, they write that Tswana norms are actually a repertoire of norms. And in fact, this repertoire often has norms that are competing and even contradictory. And so how do these get reconciled? On a case-by-case basis, right? The case comes before the forum and people negotiate as to which norm should supersede the other norm in that particular set of circumstances. And so that's, again, a situation that is highly contingent upon power, right? You need to be able to negotiate effectively in order to persuade the forum that your reading of the balance between the norms should be the one that prevails in that set of circumstances. And so women's vulnerability and their ability to be able to negotiate effectively is really, really important. What happened in South Africa is that there was a shift that took place so having represented this sort of historical narrative of what colonial and apartheid laws did, South Africa, in this moment of transition to democracy, the Constitution provided this opportunity, this moment of possibility. And actually, you saw a lot of women, even in rural communities, start to advocate for their rights and do so in ways. I mean, there's fascinating literature about how women engage with rights, period, and the fact that actually individualistic notions of rights are problematic for women because women are our autonomy depends upon our relationships. We need healthy relationships in order to make us autonomous. So we cannot think of autonomy as separation from others and being able to block other people out of our space. And individual notions of rights are structured in that way, right? It's your right to basically do things your own way and have people stay out of your business, but that doesn't work for women, and that's just interesting in general. And in fact, there are arguments that that's compelling for everybody, not just women. But in the context of Indigenous women in particular, in these rural communities, women are really kind of negotiating for that kind of notion of rights, where they take the rights from the Constitution, which are individually sort of crafted, and they contextualize them within their context, where they find themselves and their culture. And the term that's used is vernacularization, where they vernacularize the rights by sort of articulating them in terms of their culture. So an example would be something like a woman saying, yes, women are equal, but that's because our culture also says that women are entitled to being cared for, when their spouse dies. And so that's a claim to equality, but it's also one that's sort of filtered through the lens of, the cultural discourse and narratives. And so the Constitution provided this window of opportunity. And I want to tell you some other stories on the grounds that I think those illustrate a little bit the sort of generational shift that is taking place as a consequence of this opportunity that was created by the Constitution. So two other adult women, and they're younger adult women, not in their middle ages, but sort of their late 20s, early 30s, and they were faced with marital troubles. And so these were matters where these women had actually left their marital homes. And so in the first instance, Ndodakazi had received assistance from her birth family in loading movable material belongings from her marital home onto a rented truck and taking them back to her birth family with her. Again, the sort of mismatch between state models and indigenous models. In state terms, Ndotagazi was not married because they hadn't sort of concluded the final step in the marriage process. But in Zulu tradition, marriage is a process. And so she was a degree of married. So that's kind of an important distinction. So she hadn't done the final marriage dance, but she was married in part. And actually, marriages can stay that way until after the spouse dies, and they can be completed in retrospect once the spouse has died. So that's the other thing, is a marriage can be incomplete for the entire duration of the partner's lives. So Ndotagazi was in this circumstance, but they also had children. And so her in-laws, because she had done this, had laid a formal claim before the Headman's Council against her family for damaging the marital family's property and taking some property that they claimed was not hers in the moving process, particularly the refrigerator. And part of Ndodekazi's justification for leaving and her father's reasons for deliberately taking some of the husband's belongings was that the husband, Usilingo, was not maintaining their children. And as it turned out, the refrigerator didn't even belong to Usilingo, it belonged to his senior wife. And so in the Headman's Council, agreement was reached between the parties that the refrigerator would be returned in exchange for 2 cows as damages and maintenance for the children the daughter Ndotagazi had with Slimo. So this is the one matter. In another matter, the woman Matringa just left her in-laws as though she was returning home for only the weekend, and then she just never returned back to her marital home. They made 2 attempts, her in-laws, with the help of the headmans and the chief's council, to have her return to her marital home. But she said that she said before both forums that she would return, but she didn't. And the forums really pleaded with her to at least tell them why she didn't want to return, if in fact she didn't want to return, but she wouldn't say. She just told the forums that she would return. And then it later emerged that her husband was actually beating her. And so the headman in her area told us that they had ultimately managed to elicit a commitment from her husband that he wouldn't beat her again. But she still didn't return. So in the end, Cheyenne, her husband, was actually harassing the headman and saying, "Hey, what are you doing? Like this is your job. Isn't this what you're supposed to do as a headman?" This is the headman of where Matinga's birth family lives. And so where she's basically in hiding, if you will. And the headman, of course, got annoyed by this because he's like, like, what do you want me to do? Like, I can't make her do anything that she can't do, like that she doesn't want to do. And I'm not going to tell you to go and retrieve your lobolo cows, because that's the sort of divorce process, is you go back and you retrieve your cows and they go back. And in fact, Makanga still refused to go back, and she just didn't tell anyone the reason, her ultimate reason for not going back. But her family then agreed to return the cattle to the groom's family. And in fact, it was a long way to drive the herd, because they actually lived in a very distant traditional community from the one where they lived, where her family lived. So what you see there, what's different, and these are just selections from like a number of other similar sort of illustrative cases, is that in terms of what women feel that they can do, there's greater sort of leeway. Here you have these young women not necessarily standing up for themselves and saying, no, I refuse to go because, he's beating me, but actually feeling like they can just go to their birth families and not return. And so in some way, that's a form of protest, right? And so it is a form of them taking a stand for their rights. And on the flip side, you see the headmen feeling like they can't do anything about it, which is also different, because in different circumstances and, generations earlier, they would have felt that they had more sort of power to compel these young women to return and to restore the marriage relationship. And so that's an interesting thing too. And so what I say that we can take away from that is that what you had under the Constitution are a set of enabling conditions that actually allowed for women to negotiate greater security for themselves. But in the end, and actually an interesting sort of connected piece, which I think you learn from these cases too, is that actually marriage is in crisis within these communities. So there's really interesting research about just the significance of decline in marriage rates. And so from like 1921, and again, the difficulty with measuring marriage is, of course, this notion of different definitions of marriage. And so you don't know if you can trust the census data from like 1921, because they were definitely using a very narrow conception of marriage. But some colleagues have done studies, have evaluated the data, and they feel pretty confident to say that actually, at the very least from the 1960s, marriage has been in steady decline in rural communities. But the thing is that because notionally marriage is such a central part of the community structure and identity, this is something that's rejected as at a rhetorical level. Traditional leaders, so those in leadership positions in these communities who, are consider themselves the custodians of the culture and the ones who have to advocate for the culture at the national level, at the state level, at the law level, they then refuse for the laws to accommodate the fact that there are all of these women who are unmarried. And in fact, most of them have children too. And so that then becomes a problem, right? Because actually the law should be catering to people's reality and providing support and security for people where they are, rather than forcing them into a model that it's very clear even if we are going to be able to reinstate marriage rates, it's not going to be for a very long time. And so that's one of the challenges. And so then the case that I make is that, customary law legislation does this, it actually changes the balance of power, and by rejecting the reality of women's circumstances as lived in the present, it makes it really difficult for women to acquire material and physical and social security within their communities. And so actually there's examples from the legislation, such as the fact that women, so there was a piece of legislation that was proposed by the government in 2004, and actually was challenged right up to the Constitutional Court and struck down in 2010. But it was legislation that required that married partners share the property. And so even if a woman had property from before she was married to a man, she would have to jointly own that property with him, which is potentially problematic if the woman has children before, and just frankly, if she just wants to own property independently, she should be able to. But especially if she has children from before who depend on that property for their security into the long term. And so that's just one example. Another example is the Traditional Courts Bill, which was introduced in 2008, and that provided that women would have, it said men can be represented by women, and women can be represented by men according to customary law. Now, there is no customary law in South Africa that allows a woman to represent a man. There is only customary law that allows women to be represented by men. And so this is a piece of legislation that basically, presents the guise of equality, but actually is patently unequal. And again, it sort of reinforces the disturbing sort of balance of power that was created by apartheid legislation. And so these are some of the sort of legislative pieces that I talk about as being problematic. And then the final point that I make, as the font gets smaller and smaller, is that even when the government has put in place laws that actually are progressive and helpful to women, it doesn't actually enforce them. And so, for instance, I talked about the Administrative and Legislative Council that one of the women, Mazimele, actually served on. So that legislation requires that women make up a third of the council. And actually, in most of South Africa, even though that legislation has existed since 2003, in most of South Africa, women do not make up a third of these councils. These councils have not been transformed. And of course, in this particular context, Mazimele being on that council, that particular traditional community actually changed the law in 2010 to make it so that women could get land independently, especially if they had children. And so, you see how women actually can have a really significant role if they get to positions of power where they can actually influence the processes that are, going to determine their circumstances and their security and their context. And so with that, then, that's the case that I make, that actually gender matters, our power matters. And the question with respect to the law is, which class of people will the government actually engender with power through its laws? And at the present moment, it's very clear that it has chosen the side of men, but actually it really should be trying to get a balance that allows women to be able to negotiate more effectively and attain security. And so that's it from me.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As you know, I could listen to you talk about this topic all day. I did my master's thesis on this topic, not nearly to the extent of what you've been talking about. But so I have a million questions, but I'll just focus on one. So you say that women are kind of starting to feel or to understand their own power and are doing things purposely, indirectly, to get around the kind of rigid structures in which they exist. And I'm just wondering if a definition of customary law is actual practice practice law as opposed to formalized law. Is there a chance that some of these practices that these women have now started instituting can become formalized as a customary law within their community?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, it's definitely something that, we're trying to sort of watch and document as it's happening, because actually, technically, that is the definition of customary law, but it's not the definition of customary law that's been observed in the legislation over the centuries, really, right? And so it makes it really difficult because the government has tended towards the more sort of conservative notions of customary law, which are the ones that are advocated for by traditional leaders. But of course, traditional leaders are men, and so they have a vested interest in preserving the conservative notions of customary law that keep men in power. But on the other hand, the Constitutional Court has actually it's existed since 1996. Over this last sort of 20 years, 30 years, no, 20 years, over these 20 years, it has sort of gravitated towards this notion of customary law as living customary law. And so drawing a distinction between the official customary law, which is problematic in its foundations in colonialism and apartheid, and the living customary law, which is what the communities are practicing on the ground. So now cases that go to the Constitutional Court have to present robust evidence of what people are doing in practice on the ground. And we've seen some really great examples where women's rights have been able to be advanced. So one case, a woman became chief of her community because the community had developed the customary law on the ground in order to make that possible. And that was another instance of vernacularization, because the actual resolution that the community passed says, recognizing that the Constitution says that women are equal to men, and so it's amazing. It's like they very clearly said, we decide to make our customary law accord with these norms. And then another case was allowing women who are wives in polygynous marriages to have a say in whether their husband takes another wife. And that obviously is kind of controversial, because actually, even though the local customs might have developed to make it so that women can be informed, they hadn't necessarily developed to the point of allowing women to have consent rights. But the Constitutional Court said, well, our Constitution requires that women have consent rights. So they said, we recognize the living customary law and we respect it, but we have an obligation to develop it in accordance with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so I think that there is that movement happening. But the thing is that the power of the legal system is so strong, the symbolic power, if nothing else, right? I talked about how the mechanisms by which customary law had to shape around the fact that the state law didn't allow women to own property. That's the more sort of direct intervention, right? But actually the symbolic power, that's what we see with the Constitution. And I think that these laws, when they sort of support men instead of women, that symbolism goes a long way. And so the hope is that, as the legal system changes its sort of symbolic representation, the communities will also respond. Yeah.
Cindy, so will you pull up the chat box again?
Sorry,
I want to see. It's okay. I just want to see that if Lydia and Priska, if you have questions for Cindy, so if you can type them in the chat box.
Should I minimize it?
Yeah, minimize it, and then the chat box should pop up.
Oh, okay. No, that's full screen. Okay, there we go.
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So Priska and Lydia, if you have questions, and Kostas, hi Kostas.
Oh, hi Kostas.
Just type in the chat box. So do people in the room have other questions?
I'm still stuck on the stages of marriage.
Yeah.
That was so interesting.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Is there any legal, implications for what stage you're at? In other words, how much,
Interesting. You mean within the communities in terms of their norms?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So, it's interesting because it has and it hasn't been well documented. So been well documented by anthropologists to a certain degree. But the thing is that because the law had such a clear notion of there being, you're married and you're not married. Again, that was an instance where I think the law had a really significant impact on how people thought about marriage. And so when you do an analysis of the linguistic sort of developments in terms of how people talk about marriage, you see that actually that notion of marriage as a moment has come to prevail pretty significantly. And so actually you find that there are real consequences because people kind of think, well, once you're married, and in fact, people for the longest time, customary marriages weren't actually recognized as marriages. They were referred to as customary unions. And so you had to get married in the civil system as well as the indigenous system. And so again, consequences, being attributable to that part, but the indigenous system, not as much. But that said, there is a sense in which, once you, if you are, if you're sort of only just engaged, right? Like you're not as married. And so, you don't have as many rights. For instance, if there were cases that came up where women the husband would die. And when your husband dies, you're supposed to wear mourning attire, and so to mourn him, and like there's a sort of ceremony that goes through to cleanse you and what have you, that you go through to cleanse. And in this instance, the woman's family said no, she can't do this. She can't do this because he hasn't finished marrying her. And so in that instance, it was less about having done the marriage dance, and so the marriage dance is like sort of higher order marriage, but it's not like if you are married by cows having been paid as bride wealth for you, you are sufficiently married. And so in this instance, it's because he hadn't tendered cattle for her. And so I would say that that's probably the most significant marker is whether or not bride wealth has been tendered for you. But there's definitely a sense that there are higher order marriages and there are sort of lower order marriages. Yeah. And of course, in terms of like whether or not you can live together, whether or not you can get into sexual relations and that sort of thing also depends on gradations, and that will vary from community to community. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Sindiso?
She says, thanks. Just curious how you recruited the participants and how the experience was. Oh, yeah. Interesting. So I've got to say the study was pretty intense. It was actually because I was working for this action research project. We had these really good partnerships with local NGOs and CBOs. And so this was an instance where we had a relationship with the CBO, and it just so happened that the community itself actually was a community of real interest. And it was a community that has been significantly studied in other ways, like with respect to music and beading and like health, but hadn't actually been studied in terms of law, except to the extent of like people had studied violence there because obviously it being the center of the gun trade. But so we were really interested in understanding a community that is still very much intact in many ways, because a lot of communities, the sort of degree to which people are culturally embedded in like their traditions, it varies, right? But this is a very, very traditional community, as I think you saw with the photos. Sorry, just like. It's very, very rural. You see like people's little huts and women wear like traditional attire. So it's very deeply rural still. But the CBO was therefore able to introduce us to the community and sort of facilitate access and acceptance with the traditional leaders in that community, because you have to get permission from the traditional leaders before you can actually interview any participants there. And so that was the sort of critical step. But beyond that, these are communities of 50 and 80,000 people each. So, you can really mostly kind of just go around and connect with people. I'd say that the most challenging piece is the terrain. It's as you can see, like it's very rural and like dirt roads and our rental cars. I feel so bad about all those rental cars. And like, just it really is. And people are very, very poor. And so I think one of the biggest challenges in doing this kind of research is just your awareness of how even though I mean, I go out there because I'm convinced that this is meaningful work and it's going to make an important contribution to people's security and well-being in the future. But it's at a very macro level that contribution will be made. And when you're met with the individual at a one-on-one level and you're aware that the person's needs are so basic, it just feels so inadequate. And so I think for me personally, at an ethical level, I had to grapple a lot with that question of, gosh, like, how do I make this right? Aside from the fact that, I'm committed to presenting this research and essentially making it possible for people who are very far away from here, but get to make important decisions that affect people here to know what is actually happening here, right? And so, questions about, do I bring food? Do I give them money? But also having to navigate that with our CBO partners, because if we raise the cost of research for them, that also makes it difficult for them to do research in future. But also on the flip side, being aware of the fact that, initially sometimes people will think, oh, are you with the government? Because the government has done so much research, but they never see any results from it. And so that also kind of contributes to this sort of, guilt around it. So it's challenging for sure. But at the end of the day, people are so warm and just so willing to engage with you and, help you however they can and be generous towards you. So, I think it's a really sort of meaningful human experience in many ways.
Well, thank you so much, Sindiso.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Great.